Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to the Writer's House. Earlier, at 4 o'clock, we had a conversation about Sid Corman, his influence, and it was a great deal of fun. And Gregory Dunn, who is somewhere in the room, there he is. Gregory Dunn has traveled from Japan to be with us for these two programs, and we're just grateful that he came. And there are two books by Gregory Dunn that are available for sale out there in the living room, and one is his memoir of Sid Corman, and the other is a book of poems, and we'd love for you to get a copy. This is a celebration of Sid Corman, two event, a mini celebration, mini conference on Sid Corman's work. It happens to coincide for some 35,000 participants in a free online non-credit course called ModPo, where many people are reading some Sid Corman, and it happens to be this very week that we're doing that. So we are we're going live by webcast to many hundreds of people. Some are part of the program, the ModPo course, and many others are coming because we put the word out, and they're coming to us through the Writer's House site. And of course, is always the case, we're going to record this and make it available as a recording, and I'm really looking forward to it because we have 7 people plus myself who will each read a poem by Sid Corman. In my case, I will play a recording of Sid reading it, and then they're going to talk about that poem in 7 minutes or less. I'm looking at them. Because if you multiply that out, that takes us to the hour, to the top of the next hour, at which point or maybe 2 minutes beyond it, at which point we'll thank these performers, readers, poets in all case except for me, and then we will go into the other room. Not you webcast people, sorry, you'll have to have your own party. But did I say that the right way? We encourage you to tip back. Those of you in Edinburgh, and you've got all kinds of things you're celebrating right now, but all across the world people are watching this tonight, and we hope that you will, in your own place, hoist one for Sid Corman in honor of Sid. And we here will gather in the dining room, and we hope you'll stay and hang out and get to know each other more than you already do. So the order of things is as it's printed. We've given you here copies of the texts of the poems. The first volume of Sid's selected poems was 1,500 poems. So this is 8 of just, and then the next one was 750 poems selected. So, Sid Corman wrote a ton of poems, and these are 8 of those thousands of poems. It's remarkable. So I don't know if these are the best 8, but they're heartfelt 8, and we want to thank in advance the poets who've agreed to do this. What's going to happen is once I stop talking is that they will come up one at a time without introduction and read the poem and talk about the poem, why they chose it, and what's important about it. So I want to acknowledge them, and although I'll ask you to put your hands together and thank them at the end, I'm going to ask you to do that now at the beginning when I introduce them, because they won't get a proper introduction, and that's not, that's not a cool thing, but it's the way it is because of the format. So I'll ask them, you don't have to stand, but I'll ask them to raise their hands so we can thank them all together. So Laney Brown is one of the readers. She'll read first. Tom Devaney is over here. Laney, your hand up. Gregory Dunn, the aforementioned. Jen McCreary. Joshua Moses, I saw in the back there. Frank Sherlock up front. Patty McCarthy here, and me. Let's thank all these people. And for those watching by webcast, we will post the text of the poems because we know that Sid's poems are sometimes hard to come by. So we will post them, and Sid would not have been angry at us for doing that because he wanted people to have his poems. So here we go. We begin with Laney Brown reading and talking about the right.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. The right. To say sky as one says water, to pour it in to a cup and hold it at the lips and drink of it, and at sundown to drink it again as wine. Corman says that if his work has to be explained, then he has failed. So I'm not explaining anything about his work, which truly does not need explanation. How about instead we drink it up? How about instead celebration? I chose this poem, The Rite, because it is a celebration, an ecstatic act. Together we enact the poem. We do this every day. Corman is certain of this, if only we would remember to recognize it. This poem of Corman's epitomizes a recurring trope, a willful poetic intent to magnify the extent of each word, an attempt to slow time, to heighten perception. Is any word as simple as it seems? Corman's poems force a reader continually to ask how each word matters, how, as Zhukovsky says, the story must go on in each word or not at all. He explodes the tiny. In Corman, the small is never small. He asks of his reader to cultivate a minute and refreshing attentiveness to acts, everyday acts. What does it mean to replenish, to drink? How is our intake changed by how we perceive what we absorb, drink? What do we see with our eyes and hear with our ears? How is a word a door, a gate, a flag, a banner, a permission? The text almost begs, pleads with us to remember that nothing is only as it seems upon first impression. How to dwell within a moment until it lengthens reveals something hidden. The undersides or fragrances of words, of letters, of intent, the intent of the poet spills ably forward, easily reminds us to remind ourselves that to read twice is to inherit twice. And twice is never the same way twice. No two readings or two draughts are identical. If the text has not changed, then what has changed? We, the reader, come to a text changed, or we, the reader, revisit with a new intent. We, the drinker, within the rite, change water to sky, to wine. In poetry, Corman repeatedly changes water to sky, emptiness to fullness, arrogance to humility, amorphous moment to moment of clarity, and also notes each reverse of opposites. His texts remind us that endings are beginnings, that limits and separations are illusory, that perception can perform a kind of alchemy. His question is always a question of where to turn or tune attention, intent. The poem begins, to say sky as one says water. The poem begins with speech, speech being text to create, to invoke. He says, quote, poem should be immediate, should be speaking to you, meaning what is our orientation? Water falls from sky, sky reflects water, sky draws up water into clouds. Is there any difference? It would appear so, but the two are also joined as all opposites contain a hinge, poetic hinge. Corman opens the hinge, closes the hinge, anoints the hinge. Then he creates it by reminding us of its creation, by reminding us that all things stand in relation. If you stand on your head at the water's edge, it's easy to see what he means. If you fall into ecstatic love or devastation, you can also easily blur these realities through your tears. Why is it, Corman asks, that we are often far from the possibility of blurring, seeing correctly through such heightened perception? Is there even such a thing as the mundane? Not if Corman's poetry reaches us first. You can say sky and evoke water, say water and evoke sky. You can drink or swim sky, and you can also fly in water. To say sky as one says water, to pour it in a cup, into a cup and hold it, meaning to pour water or to pour sky. Is there a difference? That depends. Where exactly are you located, dear reader? This is also a dare. Are you able, at this moment, to drink sky, to hold sky in a cup? Will you join me in a toast? We are mostly made of water, sky, what we pour into a glass at any moment. We are mostly made of thought, moments, toasts. Pour yourself a poem. The right implies additional acts. To pour and lift is to prepare, a kind of benediction, a promise. What is a rite? Ceremony, ritual, custom, practice, rite, from Latin ritus, religious. What is religiosity in the context of Corman's poetry? To say sky as one says water, to pour it into a cup and hold it at the lips and drink of it. To drink is to internalize, to imbibe, to sip, but also to absorb, assimilate. In other words, to make sense of through experiential means. Corman says in a live interactive audio cast between Kelly Ryder's house in Kyoto in 2001, quote, "The word poetic makes me uncomfortable. Quote, even a child could get at it. Quote, I don't think, I feel." He wants to write something that is inseparable from experience. To say it isn't complex is illusory. To say it is easy is untrue. But to say that a child can understand it points to a state of containing opposites, wonder, which is more willing to contain the impossible as a premise, the impossible as a promise. Corman says, quote, "I make poetry out of every moment, the sunlight, whatever you see, the dust in the air, but people are afraid to see." To say sky as one says water, to pour it into a cup and hold it at the lips and drink of it, and at sundown to drink it again as wine. Sundown is another transformation. If water becomes sky, night also becomes day, and then day becomes night. Opposites hinged. And how does water become wine? Water is an ingredient, wine a complex process willed by human efforts, alchemy, wishing, intent. What if you hold the same glass to your lips and it changes? Thanks.
My name is Tom Devaney. The poem doesn't have a title. Hey, it ain't just anyone who dies, it's you. That's what makes today so clear. Hey, it ain't just anyone who dies, it's you. That's what makes today so clear. This is Sid Corman poem, and it's a voice poem. Corman comments a lot on the oral, and he comments on poems being voiced. He has a dramatic voice, and in his words, he dramatizes the words in his voice. And it's like with sound and sense, there's not a distinction between voice and the words for Corman. Hey, it ain't just anyone who dies. There's something unbelievably matter-of-fact about this poem. It's almost like he's mad at the person who's died. It's you. That's what makes today so clear. It's remarkable to think that every word in this poem is only one syllable. Hey, it ain't just anyone who dies. It's you. That's what makes today so clear. And I think at the end there are two syllables. He's slowing us down, and so clear. But it's one of those poems, being an oral poem, that's almost might not be a poem at all. It might be something that's said so quickly you can't hear it, but something that comes out of the urgency of and the necessity that it has to be said. I almost can hear the urgency of Baraka in a poem like this as well. So it's a poem that sort of it's a single gesture, and it's about someone who's died. The concept of living and dying for Corman, which he puts together, is one that he explores throughout his work. And he's not sentimental about death. And yet, what I'm really struck by in this poem, which it feels tremendously like in the American grain to me, is that, as Laney said, his poems speak to you. His book, one of his books is called Words for Each Other. It's a very relational poetics. And here the relationship is with someone who's passed on. Hey, it ain't just anyone who dies. It's you. That's what makes today so clear. This sort of off-the-cuff start and this sort of ponderous ending. One of the things that I love about Sid, and it's sort of easy to miss, is that you get to the end and I just sort of ponder. That's the poems remain open. There's no closure. There's the immensity of a life that's opened up. That's what makes today so clear. There's nothing clear about this kind of clarity. There's nothing clear about this kind of seeing that he's giving us. And I think it's one of Sid's great acts as a poet and artist to give us this space that we can enter the poem. Like many poems in the American grain out of Williams and others, you would almost think that, as Laney said again, that it was a dare, that it's sort of offhand. And yet Corman is engaging the largest issues: life, death, why we're here, the difficult of being. And it's remarkable that all this existential stuff, it just comes out in the single hit of the poem. There's nothing, there's a solemnity in the poem, but it's not unduly solemn. And that's another, he's riding all of these sort of kind of force fields. Corman is referred to as a minimalist because of the few words that he chooses to write his poems. But for me, there's a tremendous richness in his minimalism that overpowers the fact that the poems are what they are on the page. And the aftermath of the poem, when we get to the end, we must confront what we've experienced. For Corman, he says, make sure every word is doing something in relationship to the other words. And I'll just read it one more time. To me, it's a stunning poem. Hey, it ain't just anyone who dies. It's you. That's what makes today so clear.
I think I'm going to take advantage of this water. Hi. The clouds, to the right. Okay. I'm going to be reading the Declarations, and it's a longer poem. We've been reading a lot of short poems, and I thought I would choose a longer Corman poem. He does write longer poems. Just a few, before I read, I want to just make a few quick notes. This is a poem, I would say, is to his father. We had some mom poems earlier. This might be a dad poem. And it's relational, as you'd mentioned earlier, Thomas. And also there's an emphasis here on feeling again over knowledge and even language itself. Sid's father was, I believe, a Russian Jewish immigrant to America. He was illiterate. He could not read English. He couldn't write English. So apparently he couldn't read anything that Sid wrote. It's kind of remarkable. Sid left home when he was in his late 20s, early 30s, went to Europe and then to Japan, and so there was a great distance between him and his father in many senses of that word. Okay. So this is the declarations. We had said all that we had to say, saying long ago nothing, and trusted, rightly I feel, what we felt, we knew. Silence often's less inarticulate than the artifices of words. We lived in one house. That in itself meant much. And this bare house I have come to now, like all houses, houses all we may know, knowing the field mouse and the scorpion, asters burst gold against white stucco, the rust-barred windows, empty chestnuts hold glazed wicks to the sun, candelabra. I'm not there, and you're not here, and yet everywhere we move together. Who's away, who's come, and who's to stay? The questions reveal us answerers. Visiting or visited, we need not be strangers longer to one another. I am your son, Father. Father. Is that a statement or a profound prayer? And I'll make a few comments on that one. And I'd like maybe to read it again, actually, if I have the time. I'm just going to tell you what I like about the poem. And I like the way that this poem pushes against knowing and language. And he seems to want to tell us that feeling is important. Feeling is important too. Maybe more important than the artifices of words, and that this feeling should be trusted. And I think that's very Corman-esque, the sense of feeling coming before language itself. And it's something that you always see Corman acknowledging or being aware of, that language is not accurate, that it's the best thing we have, and he never loses a sense of that. And once again, we can see that every word in this poem, every syllable, every silence is functioning. There's no excess, there's no ornamentation, there's nothing to distract. I appreciate the elegant quietness of the poem as well, and the way in which Corman trusts the words themselves to reveal their significance. The word father, for example, what could be a more common word, and yet in this poem, it takes on an evocative resonance all its own that the reader can feel. Corman believed that the words actually were made by the tribe, if you will. These words that we hold in common, it's our language, this is our words, and that they have something to tell us if we listen to the words themselves. The language is already rich, besides just the poet constructing something. It's the language he goes to a lot. And something he said in a poem, I think I can squeeze this one in, Sid said, I want the words so simple and true you think they have come out of your own mouth and are breathing you. So this sense of language and the words and being able to open them up and to place them on the page in such a way as they become more evocative and resonant is very much what Sid's involved in with his playing. And I mean seriously playing with the language, the way he moves around the page. Very deliberate and purposeful, getting weight to fall on precise words. And he hits words like nothing, and he hits words like feel and felt and know and knowing. And I think he just has an ability to crack words open almost like nuts sometimes and to reveal their richness. And in this case, I think the word father for me is something that he was able to get. And I would like to read it once more. I think I have a little time. So many of Sid's poems do look very quick, but you really do have to spend time with them to realize what's in the page. They look very casual and easy. You can kind of just turn the page and go through them, but you need to kind of stay with them a bit. We had said all that we had to say, saying long ago nothing, and trusted, rightly I feel, what we felt, we knew. Silence often's less inarticulate than the artifices of words. We lived in one house. That in itself meant much. And this bare house I have come to now, like all houses all we may know, knowing the field mouse and the scorpion. Asters burst gold against white stucco and rust-barred windows. Empty chestnuts hold glazed wicks in the sun, candelabra. I'm not there, and you're not here, and yet everywhere we move together. Who's away, who's come, and who's to stay? The questions reveal us, answerers. Visiting or visited, we need not be strangers longer to one another. I am your son, Father. Father. Is that a statement or a profound prayer? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jen McCreary. This is 1848. I can sympathize with a barberry whose business is only to ripen its fruit, though maybe not sweeten it. Protect it with thorns, so all winter it holds on unless hungry crows come to pluck it. I mean, merely spend the words enough to purchase silence with, though few poets prize it. So given that and the emphasis on silence, I'm going to give you all 5 minutes of quiet meditation. No, I'm not. I'm just kidding. But you could do that when you go home. But I've been thinking a lot about meditation and in reading this poem, and about how in meditation we talk about finding stillness. The quietness of breath, the space between breath, a calming of the mind. About how in Corman's chosen home of Japan, it's said that the sound of the universe is that of a constant exhalation. And we inhabit a world where finding true silence is increasingly difficult, if not impossible. Even in nature, punctuating the quiet hum of natural sounds are car engines, jet planes, sirens, and train whistles. which maybe applies to art and the written word as well. That which can become a wall of noise. Poetry that comments and constructs and deconstructs, but leaves the reader untouched. That talks a lot, but disturbs nothing. So it's a little funny to talk about Sid Corman and about the little silences he sought to create in his poetry. I mean, merely spend the words, enough to purchase silence with. Because his is a poetry which recognizes the use of language and its limitations simultaneously. It also acknowledges the necessity of spending the words. And that's what we do, right, as poets. We utilize language as a sort of currency. But his is an economy of words. Just enough to lead the reader to that silence, that quiet, that stillness, to allow the poem to disturb the reader just enough with what it doesn't say. A poetics like a Zen koan, a poetics to frame the silence. The European barberry is a shrub that produces edible but very acidic berries, whose business is only to ripen its fruit, though maybe not sweeten it. And the thorny shrubs make harvesting them difficult, so in most places they are not widely eaten, except by birds. To protect it with thorns, so all winter it holds on. And the minimalism of the poem echoes the economy of the barberry shrub, whose silent task and singular undertaking is to nurture and protect its unsweetened fruit. The title of the poem, 1848, marks the year of European Revolution, a year which remains the most widespread revolutionary wave in European history, but within that year, reactionary forces had regained control and the insurrections collapsed. And regarding this, rather than provide commentary within the poem, Corman seeks to purchase silence for the reader's own reflection. Through the deliberate pace of each broken line, through the pauses in the separation of stanzas, and through the movement from meditating on a thorny berry shrub to his ultimate proposition, which has not been argued so much as simply stated, presented as an aside. The poem is not sweetened, it is spare and guarded, and it does not call for commentary. Corman makes a case for the ripening of silence. His poetry frames for us a silence that is turning outward to the world, a silence which might allow the reader's mind to open, escaping the noise and finding a space that cultivates, intensifies, and transforms silence into meditation, a revolutionary silence, and a poetics, ultimately, of inclusion.
I'm Joshua Moses. Thanks for having me. Thanks for organizing this event. So I'm going to read from this tattered assemblage that I'll tell you about in a second. And the poem that I chose is called Making Love. Am I the only child who has grown old in vain? The others, it seems, have all somehow managed things, learned to walk and talk and feel at home wherever they happen to be. and I have not. Have no knack for anything but obstinacy for hanging on, finding myself the genius of a body whose meaning still escapes me. Even I who say I, small spark of breath called soul by some, doubt that, and am surprised, of course, when this woman, my wife, turns to me no less, at night, to be reassured. And I, half smiling like a fool, and half crying like one lost, know that we are what we were, infants, as death, our death, reveals us more and more at birth. I first started reading Sid Corman when I was a junior in high school, about 16 years old. I had the good fortune to encounter a poet named John Perlman who put this collection together. And years later, when I told him I stole it, he replied, "You were supposed to steal it." And here it is now, many years later. So much of my interest in poetry comes from this tattered assemblage, which includes George Oppen, Charles Rezhnikoff, Carl Rakoczy, Renee Shar, Phil Whalen. They're all in there, and some of them I was lucky enough to meet, thanks to Sid, actually, including Phil Whalen and Carl Rakoczy, given Sid's vast generosity and the way he had of putting people in touch with people around the world. And of course, Sid Corman is in here. So in preparation for this event, which I was really happy to be part of because I don't get to talk to many people about Sid Corman. I'm in an anthropology and environmental studies department, and I just don't have folks around to talk about this stuff. Except Tom Devaney once in a while when we get together. So I went through the frayed and tattered letters of Sid's, and went through this and my copies of, which are now literally shit stained from a puppy that I fostered, who shit on of. Really. And so for me, any journey of reading Sid takes me back through time. It's a kind of revisitation of my life. And as he's been a companion now for, I hesitate to say it, over 25 years. So Making Love was a poem I read when I was 16, and as a young man, a boy really, it resonated quite a bit. And one gratifying thing about rereading this poem is not only to reacquaint myself with the connection felt, but to see how that connection may have changed or may no longer be there. And not to feel sad about this, but in fact to feel buoyant. The poem describes a sentiment that perhaps many people, maybe particularly poets, can relate to, in a world that seems to value a particular kind of efficacy, a kind of masculine assurity, and not the wobbly-legged self of the poem. Over the years, I frequently found myself coming back, in particular, to the phrase, finding myself the genius of a body whose meaning still escapes me. Finding myself the genius of a body whose meaning still escapes me. There's something to me so generous and redemptive about this, that the stumbling child, the man-child, or the misfit, has in fact a particular genius, an ineffable singularity. One hopes not the superficial version of, oh, yes, dear, we're all special. Hopefully something other than that. So reading Sid's work, for me, always felt like a conversation, even before we corresponded, and afterwards even more so. I find it difficult to separate his poems from his letters and the kinds of advice he gave. For instance, no poem is worth puzzling over, or some mistakes you can only make once. I think about that one a lot. Some mistakes. What were those mistakes? Well, some are things like mundane parts of life, like going to see dying people, or not going to see dying people. Those are mistakes you can only make once with that particular person. Teaching is learning to unlearn, in response to a question I once asked about teaching a poetry class years ago. So, while one sense of fitting in, making a world to inhabit, may leave one feeling ungainly at times, the vulnerability, Sid's insistence on a singularity, the particularity of living this life, the I'm the only me, never died before of Anon, this poem, which I'll read it real quickly because it's short and it relates to something Tom was saying. And these poems resonated. Both of them resonated with how I was thinking about Sid's work. I am dying and write this to you who are and will become someone like any other, alone and afraid now. Don't run away. All I want is to know someone will be there to hold my hand when needed. I'm the only me, never died before. I'm the only me, never died before. So this vulnerability, I'm the only me, never died before, the genius of my own body, has embedded within it a quiet, unstated, undogmatic ethic of seeing, feeling, and hearing that alone, I think, one could live by.
USW, which is a German acronym for and so forth. It seems likely to go on for some, well, yet, but that's weather for you. How could we have known it would all turn out this way? And what if we had? Is this that funny? But what is this or that man compared to nothing? Baby, we've all jumped from the pot into the fire. Ain't we something else? Say that again. Before there was a future, all seemed promising, but now knows better. Who are we to die? Who are we to live? There is no end and there is no beginning. There's only always this. I leave my life with you. Make of it what you can. Basho, this retreat of mine, a little old mosquito, the entertainment. Something to be said, or why would I be here, or for that matter, you? What could be clearer? A completely blue sky as empty is. That's it. That's this. And this, you must admit, is you. So this is Sid Corman for me. All the aerograms and all their seeming contradictions over the years. Here it all is in this poem. The gossip, the stories, the critiques, the tales of comings together and the fallings out, the breakings apart, all get shaved down to this diamond. One life is insignificant. Poetry gives us a chance to say, to do more than just live and then die. Living, dying. Poetry is the reason Sid was here. We are here. That something to be said. Poetry is life. I leave my life with you. Make of it what you can. When Sid talks about leaving us his life, he's not talking about his body. Sid's not talking about his spirit. He's talking about the work he committed his life to. the commitment that extended so far beyond his own work, dedicated to the work of so many other poets he championed, encouraged, and translated. Here we get Basho, that zen that we find in Sid's work time and time again. Through our correspondence, I got the impression that Sid was too cranky and critical to practice Buddhism in a traditional way. But he had a profound understanding of its essence, enough to be one of the more notable translators of Basho's work. Say again, before there was a future, all seemed promising, but now knows better. I'm stuck on these lines because my first inclination is to read this as an end of life, this is it mentality. But there's something more. Say again as to think that this more than once now knows better. Now knows better. I also read this as Corman's take on the future as an extension of the infinite present. Knowing better does not necessarily mean that the future is not promising, but that the future is now. Who are we to die? Who are we to live? That's it. That's this. And this, you must admit, is you. The life of Corman that we make has to do with something as seemingly insignificant as a mosquito in a tent, as entertainment, and the poem as essential as breath to life, and so forth, and so on, and so on.
Hi, I'm Patty McCarthy. And thank you for asking me to be here. I'm really thrilled to be part of this event. I was drawn to Corman's book, Sun, Rock, Man, because of how it revolves entirely around and in one place, Matera, Italy, and how the people in that place become infused in the landscape of the poems and the speaker's engagement in that place. Corman writes in the introduction to the book that I came to this community quite by accident, penniless, and stayed to teach for a year and a half. What I saw, what I learned, what I felt, my relations to others there, and that of earth and air, fire and water, to them and to myself, should be implicit, if not explicit, in the poems that follow. He also writes that this place is synonymous with abject poverty and backwardness to most Italians. And I think in these poems he wishes to see past this surface while still seeing it, to what else is there. I'm going to talk about the poem At. I'll read it now. At the doorway, the fingers of one hand twisting raw wool into a tight yarn, and those of the other winding it onto a peg. She keeps an eye on the street, on her wandering young son. I think my initial attraction to this poem came out of its tight symmetry, 5 stanzas, 4 lines each, the first 3 lines of which all have 4 syllables, the last 1 syllable. And its sound patterns moving from fingers to twisting to tight to winding to wandering. The sharp image work, the raw wool turning into yarn, the doorway giving way to the street. Even the woman's body, its parts seemingly working independently of each other in what we might call multitasking, is symmetrical. The fingers of one hand twisting raw wool while those of the other hand are winding it onto a peg. And it's wound into a tight yarn, which can also be a long story. So there's a second shadow image of the woman at her domestic work, talking, spinning a yarn. While she keeps one eye on the street, presumably her other eye is on the wool. Everything about the woman is doing 2 things at once. And while the wool becomes a tight yarn and she's winding it, her young son is wandering, echoing winding. And in fact, we can almost compress wandering into winding. And in a way, he is also winding, in the sense that the word can mean to take a twisting movement or course. He's winding through the street. But in another sense, he's doing the opposite of winding, because as she winds that yarn around the peg, he is wandering away from her, unwinding himself, becoming unfixed, away. She's at the doorway, in a liminal and domestic space, an entrance and an exit, away, but both inside and outside. He is on the street, a public space and a larger space, away to somewhere. I suppose one could also see as significant that the woman is on the border of this private space, doing the work of the home while looking outside of it, and the son is out in the public sphere. There's the metaphorical tether of the yarn, invisible apron strings fastening to the boy to this woman. But that tether is only a metaphor. It can't keep more than her eye on him. Well, maybe her mind, too. She can turn one thing into another, raw wool into tight yarn, but he is turning into something else, too. The freedom of wandering makes possible his own inevitable transformation into someone not young, into someone not raw, into someone out of eyeshot. I said before that my initial attraction to this poem came out of its symmetry, and that's true. But I'm also very interested in art depicting women working. The woman in this poem is doing the obvious domestic work of making yarn, but she's also doing the less visible, maybe even invisible work of watching her child. I'm interested in how Corman makes an image of this invisible action. We can see or keep an eye on him, but the invisible action is a doubled one, keeping an eye while letting him wander, in the same way her hands can do two things at once. I mentioned earlier that every element of the poem is symmetrical, and I admire how Corman has written this moment of her work in which everything about the woman is doing two things at once, doing and thinking, and made it into a single, complex image of that simultaneity. This is a stunning moment of perception which traces that image from her fingers in the doorway to her wandering son. Thank you.
I've chosen a poem that's gotten under my skin. I study genocide and I teach genocide, and oddly enough, when I do that, I'm always thinking about this poem. One of the problems, this is kind of stupid, there are many problems about genocide. One of the minor problems, but nonetheless one of the problems in dealing with the aftermath is to enable survivors to talk to non-survivors. The language of pain is difficult enough. There are, over on the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania side of Spruce Street, there are people probably this night working in their labs trying to figure out how it is that doctors can extract from patients any kind of reliable statement about the pain that they're feeling. It's very difficult. Everybody's got a different way of talking about their pain, and it's crucial for doctors to hear something of a common language about pain, because it's the one thing that they can deal with while they're dealing with the other problems that you have. So too, survivors come back from life in extremity and they've got something to say, and it's often difficult for us to understand what they have to say. So they dumb down their language and feel bad about it, or they speak in impossible, stuttering pain and we can't understand a word, and therefore isolate them even more. Enuresis is a poem in which there's a conversation between Ed, somebody named Ed, and himself, and the speaker. And they're talking about terror. This poem came to us into this room in the voice of Sid Corman in November of 2001. I'm going to play you, instead of reading it to you, I'm going to play Sid. I think of Sid as there in that cabinet there because he was coming through the speakers, and we have like 3 cameras now and all kinds, and we didn't have much. We had speakers that we were sort of holding up, and Sid was on the phone, and he read Enuresis and he introduced it. It was November of 2001, and we were thinking about terror. We didn't talk about terror that night. Sid wasn't talking about it. He didn't read poems in which everybody was doing their 9/11 poems. Sid was reading his poems. But of course, it was very hard to listen to a poem that began with the word terror and not think about how impossible it was for us to find a language that would work this out in any way. He introduces the poem, which you're about to hear. And it's crucial that you hear the introduction, because Sid first of all starts by doing his usual thing. My poems need no explanation. They're simple. And then he proceeds to do hermeneutic of the poem. He tells us who Ed is. Ed was George Evans, friend of his, poet, and someone who he tells us who fought in the Vietnam War. Though interestingly, he mentions that Ed never killed anybody. Why Ed, George Evans, never killed anybody is not clear. Was he unable to pick up the gun and shoot? Did he turn and run? Did he not see combat? But it seems fairly clear, given Sid's introduction, that the Ed in the poem is telling Sid, reporting to Sid in a conversation about his Vietnam experience, some kind of trauma, some kind of wartime trauma. It's not in the poem, but it's in the introduction. And he's trying to tell us, or he's trying to tell Sid, and Sid is trying to tell us how we are to understand that trauma. And the poem has the audacity to tell Ed, who's suffered external, non-domestic trauma, wartime trauma, that he, Sid, has suffered the trauma of home life and can therefore correct Ed, tell Ed, in fact, what terror really is. Audacious. And he does it, as I will try to explain, in a way that completely recuperates the domestic, completely recuperates the idea that we, who had to witness as children the anger of our parents, can understand the terror that's trying to be conveyed. Here's Sid. We ready?
You can see that my poems are very immediate and direct, and nobody really has to explain them to you. This one is called Enuresis. Probably few of you know. This is a scientific term for bedwetting. Ed here is George Evans. That was a nickname of his. George is one of the finest poets in America today, but very few people know it, and he's written the strongest stuff about the Vietnam War, which he was involved in, though he never killed anybody. Terror is not Ed sitting in one's piss. I know. I've sat there, I've slept there, and did most of my childhood. That was warmth, in fact, and comfort, in spite of the unconcealed, unconcealable smell. Terror? That was, and always will be, mother cursing dad. And there I am, alone in that night, hearing that door slam.
That door slam is terror, not sitting in your pee. Not bedwetting, because sitting in your pee was comfort. Terror is not, he tells the person who suffered terror. Terror is not sitting in a foxhole, peeing out of fear. That's not terror, that's comfort. That's an effect of terror. You want to know terror? I can tell you about terror. Terror was sitting in your pee most of childhood and holding on to your pee as the only thing that would provide comfort, warmth. The only warmth in the Corman household, he's saying, was my holding on to my pee. The problem with, shall we say, the psychoanalysis of the survivor is that we decide that the survivor's activity in extremis is like the experience of childhood, that it is analogous to what an infant goes through. And the infantilizing of the survivor is something that happened from 1946 until about 1978. The assumption that you regress when you're confronted with horror that you can't understand, such as in George Evans' case, we presume being in a war and not knowing what the fuck you're being there for, risking your life and peeing in your pants about that as a result of that not knowing. Sid Corman is saying, no, that's not terror. The terror is the source of it. The problem with the psychoanalysis, the Bruno Bettelheimization of the understanding of survivors, is that this isn't regression, that the domestic terror is not the thing you're remembering when you experience the terror of war or the terror of 9/11 or the terror of genocide. It's the other way around. The radical audacity here is in Sid's being able to say to Ed that he, Sid, knows this terror. Terror is not Ed sitting in one's piss. I know. I've not been to Vietnam. I've not suffered this fear, but I know. The radical audacity is saying that he knows this terror and knows this fundamental trauma and knows its effects without in any way slighting Ed or George Evans or anyone's experience with the terror of war. He's not outdoing Ed. It might seem so, but he's not. He's in fact reminding us of how basic and personal and domestic trauma is. Instead of making the usual analogy, wartime terror infantilizes us and reminds us of how young we are, how babyish we are in the face of fear. It reminds us of the traumas of childhood. Instead of making the usual analogy, wartime terror, 9/11, genocide, reminds us of childhood, Sid Corman refuses to infantilize or to move backwards with the terror. The analogy for Sid Corman works the other way. The trauma of being a child when your parents are showing extreme anger toward each other, hate each other, enough to make you keep your pee close to yourself as your only warmth, that is like the horrors of war. And therefore, he does know war. And therefore, Sid Corman can claim to understand war and dislike it, and to radically identify with those many humans who are alone in that night. Thank you. It's so great that the voice of Sid Corman in the last presentation gets to come back in this room. I hope you enjoyed Sid. I would like, please, to ask, I know it's a little corny, but I really would like to do this. I would like to ask those who presented to stand so we can see them and applaud them. And after we finish applauding, we're going to go to the other room and have a party. So, Laney Brown, please, Laney. Thomas Devaney. Gregory Dunn, who came all the way from Japan. Jen McCreary. Joshua Moses, where's Joshua? Frank Sherlock. Patty McCarthy. And this is a chance, yes, and me. And this is a chance for us in a minute to put our hands together and to praise the dead man, the man who's not here but is here. And I'm going to play a very short Sid poem that a lot of people, here it is. Here's Sid, that night.
All right. It isn't for want of something to say, something to tell you, something you should know, but to detain you, keep you from going, feeling myself here as long as you are. As long as you are.
Sid Corman. Great poet. Thank you all once again for coming. Thanks to Zach and Maura and Gabe for doing the tech. Thanks to those many who are joining us, hundreds of people joining us by webcast. And now we're going to turn that off and we're going to go into the other room, and we hope you'll stay for a long time and celebrate Sid Corman with us.